Welcome back. In the next unit, Unit 5, we will talk about Kali Linux. Kali Linux is the most prominent tool in the area of cybersecurity and penetration testing. In the first part of this unit, I will discuss the main motivation behind what we try to achieve, and this will cover the use of virtual machines and the installation of Kali Linux, and we also cover some basic Linux commands which we will use quite frequently in subsequent sessions. So first, let me talk about the main motivation behind Unit 5. Then we move into VirtualBoxes and I talk you through the installation. I already give you a warning. The installation is sometimes not straightforward. So depending on your main operating system, you might end up with certain problems. So I will talk you through how to address these issues, and of course, because I don't know what system you are working on, if you encounter any further problems, please let me know. Then I go a bit more into Kali Linux, some basic commands, and I outline the next steps in our journey. So first of all, it's important to note that we run Kali Linux in a so-called virtual machine. This is very common for Kali Linux. Kali Linux is not meant to be a main operating system. It's highly specialized. It focuses on security and penetration testing. But it's not a substitute operating system. Now, why do we need a virtual environment? The main reason is it is providing us with a safe test bed, with a testing environment. You might call this a sandbox, where you can just play around and see what happens without the risk to your main operating system. Because the things we are trying to do here could potentially be quite dangerous. And of course, the last thing we want is to actually destroy our operating system or to corrupt our files. So when we work inside this virtual environment, inside the virtual machine, we isolate our main operating system. So if we, for instance, start creating some files or a structure of folders, it does not affect our standard setup. And I think that is quite a reasonable approach. Now, virtual machines are used quite frequently, in particular in software development, when you want to test new applications, and also if you want to test whether applications run in different environments. So for instance, if you develop applications now for desktops, you would like to actually check, do they run on Windows and maybe other operating systems. In particular, what we need to run several operating systems on one hardware. Yeah, so we have our computer, we have one hardware, and we run maybe Windows or a Mac OS or Linux, and at the same time we want to run other operating systems. And later we also will set up some targets for hacking, for instance. So we need to operate several virtual machines at the same time. So in a way, using a virtual machine, we can separate software and hardware. And in fact, there has been lots of development in this area, and also there is some further development into so-called containers. They use a different technology. For instance, Docker would be an example. And I will cover this in Unit 6 in a bit more detail. Now, containers are more efficient, one has to say, compared to virtual machines in terms of space requirements and also performance. They are again isolating, and that's the main feature. They isolate applications and their dependencies. Now we will use Docker later, and we will just also use that to play around a little bit in a safe environment. So for us, the key issue is we want to try to learn something about cybersecurity and penetration testing without the fear of messing up our main operating system. Now a little discussion around Tails compared to Kali Linux. Now we have used Tails quite extensively. Tails, of course, is also a Linux-based operating system, but in fact it is quite different in terms of the main purpose and actually how it is developed. So in general, if you want to go down the route of penetration testing, Kali Linux is the obvious thing to use. Yeah, so again, we can also do these things differently, and we will touch on various applications using Python, for instance, in this context of cybersecurity. I think we do this in Unit 8, I believe, and 9. But I would say the bottom line is, if you want to do penetration testing, it's very likely you would use Kali Linux for that. Now, obviously, Tails is a live operating system. Kali Linux is not. In Tails, you have the choice of a persistence storage, but as a matter of fact, when it comes to software and other things, they have to be reinstalled. This might be done without you noticing. But it's not a massively efficient way to work. The benefit of Tails quite obviously are you don't leave a trace, and you go through the Tor network. However, you can run Kali Linux also on a USB drive. So this is in theory possible. You can use scripting, so you can do a script where you could route the traffic also through the Tor network. So that is a possibility. In fact, later we will talk about using some Python scripting where we can do some dark web searches using the Tor network, and we can automate such searches, for instance. So in general, they are used for a different purpose. I think that's the bottom line here. So whenever the focus is really on safe browsing, for instance, or potentially information gathering through the dark web, Tails is the obvious choice. Yeah, so that's I think that's the bottom line here. Okay, now comes the painful part: installing a virtual machine. Now there are different ways of achieving it, so I will outline two different ways. I opted to install VirtualBox. It is actually, I would say, maybe I personally prefer that, but there are different ways of doing it. There are some issues with it, depending on what operating system you're working on. I'm working on a Windows 10 operating system using the Win 10 Home Edition, and it has sometimes a few issues with virtual machine. So that created a few problems when I tried to actually install VirtualBox and when I tried to install the Kali Linux version on a 64-bit installer. Now, first let me navigate to these websites just to show you them. So that's here VirtualBox, where you can just, depending on your operating system, download the right package. There is quite an extensive user manual, which I highly recommend if you run into problems, and guess what, I did run into a few problems. So that's VirtualBox, so you have to download VirtualBox for maybe Windows or a different operating system. And then, so you can go here to navigate to downloads, and actually we are already in downloads, and you have various packages here for Windows and so on, and Linux distributions. Yeah, so that's the starting point. Then you would download Kali Linux. So you just follow the instructions, click on that, and you see a whole host of downloads. Again, there are different ways of downloading, and also in the slides I specify some alternatives. Yeah, so we will focus here on virtual machines. Yeah, so there are basically two main ways of doing this. There is VMware. That's the second option, which is covered in the slides, and also VirtualBox. So that's the one we would usually go for. There are alternatives, in particular also containers, so we can use it in Docker, for instance, and I might cover some of this. But personally, the main standard favorite is to go either for VMware or VirtualBox. Now, in the case of Windows users, you might sometimes run into problems. So first of all, you would download your VirtualBox and your Kali download, which comes as a 64-bit installer. And then you would, after you have downloaded both, you would open your VirtualBox manager. You click on New, and you can name your virtual machine as you want. The type you want to install is a Linux type. Kali is Debian based, so you would select the Debian 64-bit version. And then you might already run into a problem. So in my case, when I followed these steps and I came to this point, I noticed that when I opened the VirtualBox manager, I couldn't find the 64-bit version, which is a bit annoying. Only the 32-bit version are shown. Now the reason is because I'm running a Windows 10 Home Edition operating system. So it depends on your operating system that you might run into this problem. Now I followed some general guideline from the Windows 10 handbooks how to avoid this problem, but this didn't really fix it. But I will talk you through it, and it just illustrates that you have to be quite persistent with it. Yeah. So what I have done is I went into my computer's BIOS setting. Now it depends on your computer how to enter the BIOS setting. So the idea is you shut down your computer, you restart, and then you hit usually the F10 key, or maybe sometimes the F12 key, depending on your make. So in my case, I have an HP computer. I believe it was the F10 key, but I might be wrong. So I always have to try this and check it. Once you are in the BIOS setting, you can turn on the virtualization support. So that's the issue here. So this is the so-called Hyper-V, which needs to be disabled in this particular case. So this was my starting point. Yeah, so I happily rebooted. I went into the BIOS virtual machine platform, and the Windows hypervisor platform appears. So this is how it should be. But it still didn't fix the problem, as it always happens. And then I just give you a link for some further advice. So I tried some alternatives. So I again went into a tried and tested approach. and I changed my BIOS and enabled virtual machines. So in my case, I was actually right F10 on my machine. And you see this in system security, these virtual machines. You just have to tick the box. So now I have done all of that. I went back into the VirtualBox manager, and then I went into some standard settings. Yeah, so you have to fix your RAM allocation, you have to fix your hard disk, but you can see here I usually go for default settings. Yeah, so I recommend just go through the list of things that you have to modify, and it should, fingers crossed, work. Yeah, so there's some further settings on this slide, so just go through it. It should be quite straightforward to follow that. You should be okay, I guess. And also you will be then able to use your Kali Linux download. Yeah, so that is already stored as a so-called ISO file on your system when you followed the previous instruction. And I think the rest of it should be fairly straightforward. Now, then you should be asked to name your user. I went for Captain because I quite fancied it, but you can select whatever you want. You select a password, doesn't really matter. I keep things simple here, otherwise I forget, so I use Kali 2021. So please feel free to use what you want to use. And then there's various options about how you partition your hard disk. I just put down the standard things I selected, but also these settings you might like to change later. Yeah, so again, it is quite straightforward to actually follow that. The last thing is important to note, that you still need to make sure that you can boot from your main operating system. But again, if you follow these instructions, you will be perfectly fine. So finally, after doing all of that, you should go into a login window, and I will show you this in a minute. And you should be also able to resize your Kali Linux. And that's another headache, because this depends a bit on your VirtualBox version. So sometimes you might not be able to do it. If you have problems with resizing your window, you can use the following command in your Kali Linux version. I will talk about the sudo and other things later. Yeah, so just use that command. It's basically an update of your app, and that should fix it. If you use the latest version of VirtualBox, most likely it will work, and it should work in full screen mode. It's also possible, yet again, to be stuck when you start opening your Kali Linux. That happened to me again. So when I started the virtual machine, started Kali Linux, it got stuck at the start screen and didn't move forward. So what I did is I went back into my BIOS. I deselected the virtual machine platform and the Windows hypervisor platform in the control panel. And finally, I rebooted Kali Linux. Yeah, so actually this is in the control panel. This is not in BIOS. I shouldn't forget. Yeah. Again, try this if you have a problem. I suspect, because most likely you have now a more up-to-date version of VirtualBox, you might not actually end up in this problem, but you never know. So in the end, that took me about 1 day of work to get it all up and running. So I think realistically, take some time to go through this. You will find quite a bit of documentation online on various problems depending on your operating system. So I mentioned the Windows help pages for this problem, but I'm sure something similar should exist for Mac OS as well. Now there is an alternative way to run your Kali Linux using VMware. That's perfectly fine as well. I think the installation is easier, but it's less fun, so I didn't do it. But you should be also able to simply follow that on the slide, and I suspect it will be easier, and hopefully it should work without any further changes, in my opinion. Good, so I think we have covered now all the main aspects of the setup. I showed you the main ways to obtain the different software needed. So try this at your own risk. It will be a bit tricky, I would say. Most likely you might end up having a few problems. But then try to solve these problems first yourself. If you can't, please feel free to contact me and we try to find a solution. Of course, I'm not a Mac OS expert, yeah, so I can't really tell you top of my head how to fix things. I'm a long-term Windows Linux user, but I think in most cases we should be able to get this up and running. The second installation option might be the quicker option, but I recommend you just try and you see what works for you best. That's all for this unit. I see you in the next session.